63 ducks foraging amid the flooded pear orchard suddenly fell silent all at once. They simply stood motionless, every one of them turning their heads in the same direction, as if seeing something human eyes could not. At that very moment, a laugh rang out from the dirt road behind the fence. "Look at that! Even the ducks don't know how to feed in this $15 swamp." Wade Calloway, owner of the largest farm in Cedar Hollow, leaned against the bed of his pickup and laughed loudly. The men with him laughed too. "The widow buys a dead orchard just to raise ducks. Has to be the dumbest deal of the year." Evelyn Harper did not answer. She only watched the flock. The old gray hen she called Clover stepped slowly forward and swam straight across the water. Strangely, the entire flock immediately formed a long line behind her. They moved precisely along the same path, as if following a route that had existed for a very long time beneath the murkier water. The laughter behind her continued, but Evelyn no longer noticed. Experience from her late father had taught her that animals often perceive what people overlook. She rolled up her pant legs, waded into the water, and stepped exactly in the duck's tracks. Only a few steps later, she stopped short. The water where Clover had just passed was distinctly colder than the surrounding water. Not cold from shade or wind, but a steady, cool current slipping past her ankles. She bent down, touched the stream with her hand, then looked around. The orchard had no brook running through it. So where did this cold water come from? Just then Clover suddenly dived. 1 minute passed, then 2. Only a few small ripples remained on the surface. When Evelyn began to worry, the old duck was trapped under tree roots. Clover surfaced with a piece of blackened oak wood in her beak. What stunned her was not the age of the wood, but the fact that 2 of its edges had been squared as if it had once been part of some structure. Evelyn took the piece of wood, went back to the truck for a steel soil probe, and drove it down exactly where Clover had dived. Clack! The tip struck something hard. She moved 1 step aside and probed again. Another strike. 1 more step. The same. She marked each spot with small twigs. When she stepped back to look, her heart beat faster. All the contact points lay on the same straight line running through the orchard. This could not be chance. 1 year later, in front of that same gate, Wade Calloway was no longer laughing. He stood with the men who had once mocked Evelyn, carrying a contract and an offer to buy back the orchard they had once called the $15 swamp. No one mocked the ducks anymore. No one called the place dead land. A year earlier, Evelyn Harper had been only a quiet widow living in Cedar Hollow County. Her father had spent his life dredging ditches for other people's farms and always said, "Land never forgets the path water once took." At the time, she had never fully understood the meaning of those words. Now, looking at the line of steel marks under the murky water and the blackened wood in her hand, Evelyn suddenly felt the whole orchard was trying to tell her something that had been buried for decades. She gripped the steel probe, stared down at the still surface, and wondered, if something really lay under this water, why had no one seen it for so many years? The 14-acre pear orchard had been sold for only $15 at an auction almost no one attended. When Evelyn Harper placed the last of her money on the table, laughter immediately rose. Wade Calloway crossed his arms, shook his head, and said loudly, "Congratulations. You just bought the cheapest swamp in Cedar Hollow County." Another man pointed to the red sign still hanging on the gate. "Not suitable for cultivation." The whole group laughed. Evelyn did not argue. She only looked at the sign a long time, then opened the gate and walked in. The next morning, as the sun rose, the first thing she did was not clear weeds or dig ditches. She sat at the water's edge and watched the ducks. Exactly as the day before, Clover led the whole flock straight to the same spot in the middle of the orchard. They foraged about 20 minutes before scattering everywhere. Evelyn marked the place with a small wooden stake. The next morning, the ducks stopped at the exact same spot again. By the third day, the deviation was only a few dozen centimeters. It no longer looked like random instinct. She began following Clover's every step. While the ducks rooted in the mud for food, Evelyn bent down and picked up the snails left behind. They were darker than snails elsewhere, thick-shelled and coated with a reddish-brown mineral layer. She put a few in a cloth bag but did not rush to conclusions. That afternoon, Evelyn tried wading across the area the ducks had just left. Her feet sank only shallowly. When she stepped a few meters to the side, the mud immediately rose nearly to her ankles. She went back and tried many more times. The result stayed the same. Under the murky water lay a narrow, hard strip of ground running in the direction the ducks usually took. From that day, Evelyn began keeping notes. Each morning, she marked the first place the flock stopped. Each evening, she measured the water level with the same wooden stake. She used an old thermometer to check temperatures at different points and recorded every number. Wade Calloway drove past many times and always laughed. A swamp doesn't dry up just because you write in a notebook. Evelyn stayed silent. She kept observing instead of arguing. In the days that followed, the numbers gradually told their own story. The place the ducks gathered was always several degrees cooler than the surrounding water. The water level there changed more slowly after each rain. The dark snails appeared only in a very narrow band. Evelyn took a map of the orchard, plotted each point on paper, and connected them all. At first, she thought they would form a straight line, like the points the steel probe had struck. But the more she connected, the more the path curved gently westward and then swung south. She checked every note, every timestamp, every location. The result did not change. The ducks were not moving at random. They were repeating the same route every day. On the 12th day, Evelyn brought the notebook out to compare with the ground. She followed that curve step by step. It passed through the cold water, crossed the hard mud strip, and stopped under a pear tree that had been dead for many years. The trunk was silvery white, dry branches reaching toward the sky like thin arms. Clover stopped right there too. She lowered her head to the water but did not forage. The whole flock stood still behind her as if waiting. Evelyn placed her hand on the trunk and looked down at the water at her feet. Every note from nearly 2 weeks led exactly to this place. If the ducks were not looking for food, then what were they leading her to under that dead pear tree? The next morning, Evelyn did not bring a large shovel or any digging machine. She carried only a garden trowel, a measuring tape, her notebook, and the steel soil probe. If her father were still alive, he would surely have repeated the familiar saying, "When you don't yet understand what the land is hiding, don't dig more than necessary." So Evelyn decided to dig only where the curve in the notebook ended, right under the dead pear tree. She brushed the layer of rotting leaves aside and gently skimmed thin layers of mud. After only a few minutes, the trowel struck a layer of small, round pebbles packed tightly together. What surprised her was that the pebbles were almost identical in size, completely different from natural gravel that mixed every size. She scooped up a handful, rinsed them clean, and put them in the cloth bag. This was not original soil. Someone had brought these pebbles here long ago. Evelyn marked the depth and location, then dug a few more centimeters. Under the pebble layer appeared oak planks that had turned black from long immersion in the damp environment. They had not completely rotted and still kept their shape, laid parallel like a supporting layer. Evelyn used her fingertips to brush the mud from the surface. The edges of the wood were cut very straight, proving this was not random roots or fallen trunks. She noted again, quickly sketched the position of the wood layer in the notebook, and dug a little deeper. This time, the tip of the trowel struck something hard with a clear clack. After clearing away the mud, a section of reddish-brown ceramic pipe gradually appeared. The surface of the pipe was coated with minerals but still intact. Evelyn had never seen any pipe like it on the farms around Cedar Hollow. She did not try to pull it up. Instead, she gently widened the hole a few dozen centimeters on each side. The pipe continued and then disappeared under the soil. Evelyn stood silent for a few seconds. What the ducks had led her to was not a single object, it was a structure. That afternoon, she returned with the measuring tape and small wooden stakes. Based on the points the steel probe had struck, she located more spots. At each place, she dug only a very small hole, just enough to observe, then filled it right away. The second hole also had a pebble layer. The third revealed oak planks exactly like the first. The fourth exposed another section of ceramic pipe. The small discoveries gradually fitted together into a complete picture. That night, Evelyn spread all her notes on the table. She used a pencil to connect the locations of the ceramic pipes. One line crossed another, then branched out in many directions. It was not just one pipe running through the orchard, as she had thought. Under the ground was an entire network laid out deliberately, connecting from the higher ground in the north down to the low area in the south, and then looping back to the old creek that had been filled in decades earlier. Evelyn stared at the diagram. Someone had built a large-scale drainage system for this orchard long ago, and over time everything had been buried and forgotten. The strange thing was that no county records ever mentioned the structure. Previous owners of the orchard had never spoken of it either. Without the ducks, it might have remained under the mud for many more years. The next morning, Evelyn decided to try a small thing. Using the diagram she had just drawn, she found a spot that looked like an old inspection hole, and carefully cleared the mud and rotting leaves that sealed it. When the last layer of mud was removed, a slow, muddy stream flowed into the opening and disappeared below. Within a few hours, the water level around that area dropped noticeably. The foul mud smell that rose every noon also lessened considerably. By afternoon, the ducks gathered in far greater numbers than previous days. They foraged continuously around the newly opened area, making Evelyn believe she had found the right answer. She smiled for the first time since buying the orchard. Perhaps opening a few more inspection points would bring the whole place back to life. That night she closed the notebook with a hope she had never felt before. But when darkness fell, a strange sound suddenly rose from the orchard. Not the sound of water, not the sound of wind, but dry, heavy crack sounds, as if something very large were slowly fracturing underground. Evelyn grabbed the oil lamp and ran outside. Standing in the darkness, she looked toward the dead pear tree and realized the ground under her feet was making noises that no one in Cedar Hollow had heard for decades. After opening the first inspection hole and watching the water drop, Evelyn believed she finally understood the orchard's secret. The next morning, she brought her hand-drawn diagram and marked 3 more spots she thought were still buried inspection points. Instead of digging large, she still opened each small hole, but this time she was no longer as patient as before. Whenever water began to flow, she opened another point. By the end of the afternoon, all 3 holes had been cleared. The results appeared almost immediately. The water level in the area dropped faster than any previous day. The black, foul-smelling pools began to shrink. The air freshened, the sour mud smell nearly vanished. The ducks came in greater numbers day by day, crowding around the newly opened channels to find snails and insects. Evelyn stood in the middle of the orchard, and for the first time felt her efforts had been rewarded. She opened the notebook and added a short line. The system is still working. That night she even allowed herself to think of the first autumn when the pear trees would bear fruit again. But nature did not take long to answer. The next morning, the moment she stepped out of the tent, Evelyn immediately sensed something wrong. A patch of ground near the dead pear tree had sunk noticeably. Small cracks ran zigzag across the newly dried mud. She ran to check, and the ground under her feet suddenly sank several more centimeters. The dry sound of breaking earth rang out. Only a few minutes later, an entire stretch of bank collapsed into the water below. The pebble layer was washed away. The ancient oak planks were exposed with nothing left to hold them. Right beside them, the roots of an old pear tree were pulled up out of the ground. Fine roots that had lain quiet in the damp for decades now lay bare under the sun. Evelyn stood frozen. She did not understand why a system that had worked well the day before had become the cause of the orchard collapsing after only one night. She hurriedly ran along the inspection holes. Water was still flowing very strongly, much stronger than the day before. Only then did she realize what she had overlooked. It was not that the system had failed, nor that the orchard was too weak. She herself had caused everything. By opening several inspection points in succession on the same day, she had released far too much water at once. The soil had not had time to adapt to the sudden change. The mud layer that had been supporting the voids below had been drained too quickly, throwing the ground out of balance until it collapsed. She had thought the faster the drainage, the sooner the orchard would revive. But nature operated by a different rule. Just as Evelyn was still trying to shore up the collapsed bank, the sound of a pickup engine rose behind her. Wade Calloway stopped right in front of the gate. He pulled out his phone and filmed continuously from the moment he stepped down. "Everybody look!" Wade laughed into the camera. "Here's the genius who bought the $15 swamp. Now she's making it collapse all by herself." Within a few hours, the video appeared on the town's community groups. People shared pictures of the eroded orchard, along with mocking comments. Some said the widow had destroyed the last thing left. Others claimed the ducks would die too because there would be no water left to swim in. By afternoon, a few more cars drove past just to look and laugh. Evelyn no longer had the strength to explain. She sat alone at the edge of the collapsed bank, watching the ducks quietly scatter away from the disturbed area. For the first time since buying the orchard, she thought maybe everyone had been right. Maybe this place could not be saved. Maybe her father had been wrong too. That night she opened the notebook, read every page again, then closed it. Her eyes rested on the ducks sleeping close to the water's edge. If she just sold them, she would have enough money for a ticket out of Cedar Hollow and a new life somewhere no one knew of this failure. The thought stayed in her mind a long time. The next morning, while Evelyn still stood before the sinkhole with a shovel in her hands, an old man leaning on a cane approached slowly. He did not look at the pile of fallen earth, nor at the ceramic pipe sections just exposed. He only bent down, scooped a handful of still damp soil, squeezed it lightly in his palm, and let it fall. After a few seconds of silence, he raised his head, looked at Evelyn, and said only one sentence. "You just made the land breathe too fast." The old man stood quiet a long time beside the sinkhole. He did not ask why the orchard had flooded, nor comment on the ceramic pipes now visible under the soil. After walking around once, he leaned on his cane, came closer to Evelyn, and introduced himself as Walter Boone, a man who had spent more than 30 years designing and maintaining irrigation systems for farms in southern Missouri before retiring. Wade Calloway stood in the distance and gave a thin smile. He thought Walter had come only to witness the widow's failure. But contrary to everyone's expectations, Walter did not pick up the shovel stuck in the ground. He also did not step down into the hole to fix anything. Instead, he sat on an old log and watched the ducks swimming slowly around the freshly eroded area. After a few minutes of silence, he turned to Evelyn. "Why does the flock come back to the exact same spot every morning?" Evelyn thought, then shook her head. "I don't know yet." Walter asked again. "Why is the water there always colder than everywhere else?" She stayed silent. He continued with a third question. "And why do the dark-shelled snails appear only in that exact strip of ground?" Evelyn opened her notebook and turned through every page. She had complete data on water temperature, water level, the ducks' positions, and even the color of the snails. But she had never asked herself why all those phenomena were connected. Walter smiled. "You've observed very well, but you're still trying to answer with what you want to see instead of what the land is saying." He picked up a dry stick and drew a simple curve on the ground. Most people think water is the enemy. They look for every way to push it away as fast as possible. But land does not live by being dry. Land lives by balance. He drew small circles along the curve. The people who built this system decades ago were not trying to dry the orchard. They only guided the water to where it should be, then held it there long enough for the soil and the tree roots to breathe together. Evelyn looked down at the diagram she had drawn for weeks. Suddenly she understood why the pipes did not run straight. They curved, branched, and rejoined to slow the water, not to dump it as fast as possible. Walter looked at her and said slowly, "Healthy land does not fight water. It teaches water where it needs to stop." That sentence made Evelyn remember what had just happened. Her mistake was not in finding the drainage system. The mistake was opening 3 inspection points at the same time, forcing the entire volume of water out of the ground in a single day. That very haste had thrown the soil out of balance and made it collapse. The system had never been wrong. The person using it had been wrong. Walter did not hand her any design. He also did not tell her where to dig or how to repair. Before standing up, he only pointed at the notebook in Evelyn's hands. "The answer is still in what you've already recorded. Only yesterday you read it looking for speed. From today, read it looking for balance." With that, he leaned on his cane and left, leaving Evelyn alone in the orchard. That afternoon, she spread the entire diagram on the wooden table inside the tent. For the first time, she did not mark the places where water dropped fastest. Instead, she marked the places where water dropped slowly but steadily, the areas the ducks returned to most often, and the stretches of ground that still kept their firmness after the water level changed. The more she compared the notes, the more she realized everything pointed to the same principle. The water had to be guided step by step. It must not be released all at once. Evelyn crossed out the old plan and redrew from the beginning. This time, each inspection point would be opened in stages. After each opening, she would wait for the water level to stabilize, remeasure the temperature, observe the ducks, and continue only when that area no longer showed any change. It would no longer be a race against water, but a process of learning to listen to the land. Just as she set the pen down on the last line of the new plan, the old radio on the table suddenly broadcast an emergency weather bulletin. The announcer reported a strong low-pressure system moving very rapidly from the west. Within the next 48 hours, Cedar Hollow would receive the heaviest rain since the beginning of the year. Evelyn raised her head and looked out at the orchard sinking in the sunset light. She had exactly 2 days to know whether she had truly understood the voice of the land, or whether everything would be swept away once more. 48 hours before the storm was forecast to hit Cedar Hollow, Evelyn Harper started over from the beginning. This time she brought no impatience and made no effort to prove herself right. She carried only the notebook, the old thermometer, a measuring tape, and a few wooden stakes. She reopened the first inspection hole, but instead of clearing all the mud as before, she removed only a thin layer. Then she sat down and waited. An hour passed. She remeasured the water level, wrote it in the notebook. 2 hours later, she checked the temperature of the cold current flowing past her feet. Wrote again. By afternoon, when the water level had stabilized, she widened the opening only a few more centimeters. No more than that. Every step was measured, recorded. Then she waited for the land to react on its own. The next day, she repeated the exact same process at the second inspection hole. The ground no longer trembled. No new cracks appeared. That told Evelyn Walter had been right. The problem had never been the system. It had been the speed at which people interfered with it. While she continued working, the ducks again caught her attention. For the past 2 weeks, Clover had always led the whole flock to the area around the dead pear tree. But that morning, the moment she entered the water, she suddenly turned southeast, followed the edge of the old fence, and stopped near a thick clump of willows. The entire flock immediately changed direction with her. Evelyn did not overlook the detail. She took the map, marked the new position, and waited after them. The water here was not colder, but the current under her feet was much stronger than elsewhere. When she drove the steel probe down, she struck something hard at the same depth as before. She did not dig it once, but compared the entire diagram again. Only then did she realize all the pipes converged toward the willow clump. This was not a side branch. This could be the main outlet of the whole system. Evelyn dug a small hole right at the edge of the bushes. After only a few minutes, the tip of the trowel struck the mouth of a ceramic pipe larger than any section she had ever seen. But instead of water flowing through, the inside was packed with tree roots, rotting branches, and layers of leaves that had accumulated for years. The main outlet had been sealed for a very long time. The previous time, if she had tried to yank all those roots out at once, she would probably have repeated the old mistake. Evelyn drew a deep breath and did exactly what Walter had taught. She did not yank hard. She used a small saw to cut each section of root, lifted handfuls of rotting leaves out of the pipe mouth, then stopped. She waited for the water to adjust itself. After an hour, she measured the water level, wrote it in the notebook. A little more debris was removed. Waited again, measured again, wrote again. The cycle repeated all day. By afternoon, a small stream began to slip through the newly cleared gap. It did not rush. It only flowed steadily and gently, as if the system were waking after decades of sleep. That night, the western sky turned lead gray. The wind began to strengthen. The radio continuously broadcast warnings of the large storm approaching. People in town tied down barn roofs, moved livestock to higher ground, and sealed their windows. Wade Calloway drove past the orchard, saw Evelyn still bent over the inspection holes, and shook his head. He believed one heavy rain would wash away everything she had done. At dawn the next morning, the storm struck. Rain poured down as if an entire river were being dumped from the sky. Within a few hours, water from the hillsides surged into the orchard. Evelyn stood under the porch roof, eyes fixed on the water-level stakes. This time, she could do nothing more. Nature would give the answer itself. The water flowed toward the inspection points that had just been cleared. There was no sound of collapsing earth. No bank broke. The water level rose, and then slowly fell exactly according to the rhythm she had recorded in the notebook. The ceramic pipes quietly guided the water through each branch the way they had been designed decades earlier. When the rain eased toward the end of the afternoon, Evelyn carefully walked the entire orchard. The places that had once sunk deep remained intact. Tree roots were no longer pulled up. The water did not cut across the ground. It flowed quietly toward the main outlet under the willows. 3 days later, when the ground began to dry, the first green shoots appeared on many pear trees that had seemed dead. Evelyn, the county agricultural officer, counted every trunk. More than 120 trees were still alive and beginning to recover. The orchard that all of Cedar Hollow had once called a dead swamp had only been waiting for the water to find its old path again. The next morning, while Evelyn was writing the last line in the notebook, a knock sounded at the door. She opened the tent flap. In front of her stood Wade Calloway. For the first time since the day she set foot in Cedar Hollow, he was not smiling. 1 week after the storm, Cedar Hollow became unusually quiet. The water had completely receded from the orchard. The ground that had been flooded year-round was now dry enough for people to walk across without sinking. What made Evelyn smile most was not the numbers in the notebook, but the ducks. They no longer swam in circles around the orchard. They walked leisurely on the dry ground, pecking insects among the rows of recovering pear trees. The drainage system had finally returned the land to its proper state. A few days later, Wade Calloway appeared at the gate. For the first time, he did not bring a mocking smile. He took off his hat, looked at the orchard, and said briefly, "I didn't come to buy the land. I want to learn." Evelyn did not answer at once. She only handed him the small shovel and smiled. "Start by observing." At that moment, Walter Boone leaned on his cane and walked up. He looked at the old red sign still hanging in front of the gate. Not suitable for cultivation. He did not take it down. He only took a piece of charcoal from his pocket and wrote a small extra line right underneath, "Unless you understand the land." No one said another word. A few weeks later, the old pear tree beside the long-dead stump bore its first fruit. Evelyn gently picked that small pear when a little boy ran up and pointed at the ground. "Auntie." The ducks changed direction again. Evelyn bent down to look. Clover was still leading the whole flock in a straight line toward the western corner of the orchard, a place she had never surveyed. She laughed, closed the old notebook, and took out a new blank one. Perhaps the orchard still had another story it wanted to tell. Many people had asked why the ducks knew where to go. In truth, they were never looking for treasure. They only followed the insects, followed the current, and followed the places where the land still held life. The only difference was that Evelyn was the first person patient enough to watch them every day. Frontier wisdom. Nature rarely hides the answer. Most people simply stop watching too soon. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves frontier history, forgotten wisdom, and the quiet lessons nature teaches. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care, and keep learning from the land.